Okay, so we're delighted to have with us tonight Ryan D. Coholan, Chief Operating Officer of the MBTA, this evening with a program titled Readiness Meets Reality, the South Coast Rail Transformation. Mr. Coholan was named Chief Operating Officer of the MBTA in September 2023. Prior to that, he served as the T's Chief Rail Officer for 9.5 years. Before coming to the MBTA, he was General Manager of Cape Rail Incorporated. He started his railroad career with the Bay Colony Railroad, Cape Cod Railroad, where his roles included engineer, conductor, rules examiner, dispatcher, train master, track foreman, and mechanical. So, Ryan, welcome to Mass Bay RRE this evening.
David, good evening. Thanks so much for having me. All right, excellent. So once again, good evening, and David, thanks for the introduction. My name is Ryan Coholan. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the MBTA, like David said. Lots of familiar names in the chat, so it's great to reconnect. Some folks I haven't talked to in a while. Some folks I know from my history on the Cape, and some folks just from out and about in the industry. But 32 years later, you tend to connect a lot of names and a lot of faces, and even just seeing names on photos I catch online. It's great to know that we have so many advocates behind the MBTA and everything that we're doing in Boston and beyond. And I'd be remiss if I was going to talk about South Coast Rail, and I didn't include behind me the 1071, one of our heritage painted locomotives. Stay tuned because I have a couple more surprises that should be out in the next 2 weeks and then probably the next 4 weeks. So just stay tuned. But obviously, we're going to talk about South Coast Rail, the old colony lines. It's only fitting that I have a McGinnis painted F40. So tonight we're going to talk a lot about South Coast Rail, and in particular, we're going to talk about the testing in early operations. Before we get into the details, everyone I think is familiar, at least on the cusp, with South Coast Rail and the fact that this was a almost 40-year project in the making, several administrations in state government, and it suffered through a lot of fits and starts, as a lot of projects do in this business. But we were able to put shovels in the ground to do a lot of early work, and we'll get into some of the early work we did. We'll talk about the whole timeline and then really what it takes to put all of that into service. Well, obviously, a railroad like this section of territory was, predominantly a 10-mile-an-hour freight line without seeing any revenue passenger service. It takes a lot in the days of positive train control and all of the regulations that have changed to make sure that we get to where we have to go. So I want to tell you that story, talk about how it was built, how we got it safe, ready to operate, and then a little bit about once we began to move passengers, what type of episodes, issues did we run into? So there's lots of railroad folks who have made careers. I see some names in the chat. That's great. But building a railroad is really not much different than building a house like it shows on the screen. You start with a foundation, walls, roof, finish it, trim work. And the whole time, you're testing each of those individual elements. You're making sure the foundation is watertight. You're making sure the roof is watertight. The walls are what they need to be. And then, really important, how all of those things work together. Your plumbing, drainage, septic, electrical, all of those components have to work correctly together. And it has to work correctly time after time after time. You don't want to turn a light switch on and your faucet start to run randomly. So we spent a lot of time, comparing, building a railroad to just like building a house. You don't pour the foundation and then wait till the house is finished to see if it can actually hold the structure. All that testing is incremental. So when the foundation gets poured, you test it. When the frame goes up, it's checked to make sure everything's square, the framing is sound, and before you put the roof on, obviously walls, wiring, plumbing, all that gets added. But every step is dependent on the previous step being done perfectly. And of course, in this very heavy regulated industry, we have a lot of checks and balances to make sure that things are perfectly. And at the very end, which everything is working properly, just like your house, is a building inspector comes out, they issue you an occupancy permit, and only after that can you actually move in and start to live in your house. So we follow the same logic. It's just on a really big scale, a little more complex, obviously dealing with track, power systems, signal systems, communication systems, train control systems, interfacing with dispatchers, train crew, engineer, conductors. A big part of South Coast Rail was how we interface with the communities. So, police, fire, public safety, and making sure, again, all of those systems are working together, and then we progress forward. And at every step, the same questions apply. Does it work? Does it work with everything else? And does it work consistently over time? So a little bit about the house we built, and to give you a idea of the scale and complexity. Um, Up on the screen, you can see sort of our milestones. And I talked about some of the early work that happened prior to us actually proceeding with the maybe the more traditional railroad reconstruction. We did a lot of early work, 14 bridges. We did those back in 2020. We started to do culverts actually back in 2016, 2017, all in anticipation of this coming together. So the timeline from when the project became real and was going to move forward, right up until opening day, March 24th, 2025, almost a year ago. Um, our house, I keep using the house anecdote a lot, but our house consisted of 37 miles of track, 14 rehabilitated bridges, a total of 86 culverts were replaced, and a brand new pedestrian bridge in New Bedford, which actually connected the community with the station across Route 18. As far as stations go, we built 6 brand new passenger stations, 2 layover facilities, which of course gets back into the whole everything has to work together. I can't run service to Fall River without a place to park trains. Otherwise, spend an awful lot of time and resources deadheading equipment around, and it's just not where we need to be. So that's, the stations and track, and you can touch all that. But behind the scene is all the safety systems, the train control systems, and that's where testing really takes on a whole role to its own. As part of South Coast Rail, we built up 14 new interlockings, all to manage crossover moves and keep the system flowing. 18 grade crossings were upgraded with all new active warning systems. A lot of these crossings were DC track circuits, no gates, just flashing lights in the woods. So we upgraded all of those, and then of course an entirely new wayside and cab signal system. And then you layer on top of that the requirement for positive train control. And then everything that supports everything to work together: radio communication systems, phone systems, wayside communication systems, plus the power, whether it's commercial or backup power, to actually run all of this stuff. And, think back to, I keep going to keep picking on the house analogy. Every one of those components had to be tested individually and then tested together. And then we had to continue to prove that over time, all of those systems would still work together. Um, and the testing is pretty involved. To give you an idea of what the actual scale of testing, you know, anywhere from 7,000 to 11,000 individual tests across all of those systems. Talked about it has to work in a specific order, and a lot of times we find ourselves at test 300 out of 450, and we get to test 301, and we'd have a problem. You have to start all over because again, whatever changes you make at test 301 means that you could have affected how test 100 to 300 or test 001 to 300 all worked. So you have to start over again. Testing, that whole program is structured around the individual systems and what we installed at South Coast Rail. But they require sign-offs at different checkpoints, and then ultimately, when it all gets ready for service, the Federal Railroad Administration has the opportunity to weigh in as well. So everything has to be, I's dotted, T's crossed. Aside from the signal system, track inspections, obviously, the whole time we're building this, Mass Coastal Railroad is still providing freight service. And aside from some outages where we had a significant amount of work that had to happen where they couldn't run the freight service, we still had to provide a way for that material to get moved. So it's definitely a unique juggling act. And then once you start to qualify crews, that's when you bring in the public safety aspects of it. And once all of that is in a place where the FRA deems that you are where you need to be, you move into a simulated service, revenue service demonstration, which is it's just that. Trains operate, they simulate station stops, they operate the actual schedule to make sure that it is all achievable in the real world. The only thing missing during that simulated service are actual paying passengers. Every station stop gets made, every door gets opened, all of that. Again, you're testing to see how it all works together. So before we even move a person, before we sell a ticket, 11,000 distinct tests and qualification events before we ever move a person. Um, Most of those tests are laid out in the CFR, but a lot of times, depending on the specific system a railroad decides to install, we have to create what the testing criteria looks like. In many of those tests, we have to run repeatedly. You have an interlocking, like at Myrick's, where you have the Fall River line come into the New Bedford line, 4 tracks, a crossing in the middle of it. There's literally 1,000 tests just there, and every route has to be checked and tested again. And like I said, if one thing isn't where it has to be, you make the adjustment and you start all over again. So, that 11,000 number, once you look at the volume of individual tests, in some cases, we would reach up over 100,000 individual tests, whether it's signal, um, wayside communications, it adds up quickly. But that's important because I talk a lot about having to do this consistently, repeatedly, over and over and over again, because once you're up and running, it's hard to say, hold on, we're going to take a couple of days and make these adjustments. So you have to show consistent performance, particularly with the regulations surrounding positive train control. So we'll talk a little bit about the individual systems now in the actual test. So signals, interlockings, that's really the visible and probably the most in-depth amount of testing. It's the backbone of operating a passenger service in this day and age. Just in the category of signals and interlockings, over 3,000 individual tests, and they cover routes, switches, signal aspects, signal locking logic, timing sequences, so you can't throw a switch too early if you're a dispatcher, power systems, failover systems, backup power systems, and again, everything has to work perfectly time after time after time. And it has to be sequential. Like I mentioned, we had 14 interlockings to validate across the whole corridor. And as a train is traveling through one interlocking, it's already talking to the interlocking ahead of it. It's talking to the interlocking behind it. So it's not just the one that you're testing, but it's how it interacts with everything on either side of it. Um, each interlocking controls how that train moves through that specific territory. But again, you need to make sure that you can't establish conflicting routes. Some interlockings are a simple crossover or a universal crossover. Some introduce other lines onto the line that you're on. And I'll look at Myrick's again for a second. So you really have to make sure that you can't establish conflicting routes. Myrick's alone, over 500 specific tests. But when you add that across every route, include the crossing in the middle, that's how you get into these big multiples. It's not the same test over and over again. Every test is a little different criteria, a different route, a different speed, particularly when you look at grade crossings. we test those out at incremental speed increases to make sure the proper warning time is given, to make sure everything works as it's supposed to. But then we also intentionally degrade the system, operate it on battery power, on backup power, take it off commercial power to see how it's going to behave under those scenarios too. The ATC system and the PTC system. It's a category all to its own. ATC is the primary. Positive train control is a overlay to make sure that all of those signals are in fact being complied with. The ATC system alone, between 1,500 and 2,500 different tests. And again, that's a ATC and cab signal system, sort of an interchangeable term here. Our design standard is a cab signal system with home signals at the interlockings. Um, so you don't have all the automatic signals in between with positive train control. You're able to remove all of those systems. When we installed positive train control in the north side operation, we removed all of the automatic block signals out there because we installed a cab signal system. So you have to check, the cab signal codes, speed transitions, which is a big thing when you talk about cab signal systems and PTC systems, because you want to make sure you don't set the engineer up for failure. We like a smooth ride. Passengers will complain if the ride is too rough. A boxcar seldom complains. So making sure that the braking curves are where they need to be, braking enforcement thresholds are where they need to be. It's just because we have it on other parts of the system, it's how it works in this territory. Curvature comes into play, grades come into play. Of course, MAS and permanent speed restrictions also all play into those calculations. Um, Both the ATC system and the PTC system, they all interact with, I described earlier, the interlockings ahead of, the interlocking that you're working through, and the one behind you. And again, that backbone, it's repetition, it's test until it's perfect every time. Um, with the advent and the requirement of positive train control, that added almost an additional 1,000 tests. And that goes beyond actual train control signaling, but we get into civil speed limits, roadway worker protection, and of course, if those systems fail, how does the system still operate in that degraded mode? What does it do to your timetables, your speeds, your schedules? What does that all mean? So when we test that, we have to test it in sort of the worst case scenario as well. Um, and we're out there treating it just like we would, simulating right down to if the locomotive engineer does not acknowledge a civil speed restriction, does the PTC system take over and break the train? So again, just because we've used it in other parts of the system for years and years and years, new territory, new set of tests, and treat it like it's brand new. Grade crossings, we've hit on a little bit. Every crossing, 150 to 300 for all 18 crossings. We test those at, again, different speeds. We also test how they interact with the highway traffic control signals as well. That's a very important part. The South Coast Rail Territory runs through some rural area, some metropolitan area. It's a very mixed bag. And like I talked about really early, people who live in that area, they were used to a 10-mile-an-hour freight train. So all of a sudden we show up running, multiple trains a day at high speeds. It's a whole new world because a big part of the testing, and I think acclimating folks to what it's like to live next to a railroad that runs upwards of 60 revenue passenger trains a day, intermingle the freight service, and it's a lot. And that can be taxing, especially on local public safety. We spend a lot of time working with, as far as emergency preparedness, working with local police, fire, schools, hospitals, emergency medical services to know exactly how to respond anywhere on the line, how to get to it, and then once you're there, here's a train. What do you do with it? How do you make it safe so that first responders can do their job? The amount of rail education, the South Coast Rail Territory prior to the passenger service starting up, 10-mile-an-hour freight railroad, lots of dirt bikes, lots of people just going for walks in the woods, walking their dog, walking themselves, and they get used to stepping out of the way for the occasional train. So we made it a point to start the education part of this service is coming. We started that almost a year in advance, and we were able to create um, some really great training material, not just for the moment, but for the long term. Because as we were going to the new communities as part of the South Coast Rail area, a lot of communities that had been part of the opening of the Greenbush line or the opening of the original Old Colony lines in the late 90s, a lot of communities came knocking on our door and said, "Hey, we hear you're doing this training for Fall River. We'd love to be part of that," because in the background, and think about it, when the Old Colony first was rebuilt in the late 90s and opened up, you fast forward to the year 2025, you have a whole career of firefighters and police officers that they've retired. And so you have a lot of new people coming into public safety who have never had this type of training. So everything we did for South Coast Rail, we made it so it was repeatable. It was portable. We could bring it to any police department, fire department, whoever wanted training. So what we developed was it was made to stand the test of time, not just for the opening of South Coast Rail. The last bullet on this page talks about simulated service, and that was really the final validation over about 100. I think we actually spent 165 consecutive days um, doing that simulated service testing. And again, sustained, repeatable, and across the full corridor. We ran the line as if people were actually on board. We followed the schedule right down to the minute, um, stopping at every station, doesn't matter the weather condition. And this had to demonstrate that the entire system could work reliably day after day, and all those systems worked together before we ever sold a ticket. Talked a lot about everything you see out in the field, but what's behind the curtain is just as intense when it comes to testing, validating, and uh, moving into service. Dispatch and control systems, each of those require anywhere from 2 to 400 tests each, validating the dispatching logic compared to the actual design, how it actually works in the field, the comm systems between dispatchers, trains, the radio systems, and not just for operating the line, but maintaining it too, because you have a radio on the locomotive, a radio at CTEC in Boston, but in between you have lots of maintenance folks who have to get access to the track to keep the whole thing running. So how all those systems work. Power systems. When I say power systems, this means anywhere from commercial power to backup power. As I mentioned, a lot of and we'll pick on grade crossings for a little bit. These were, DC track circuits with a battery well, and they could operate on a very small, 20 or 30 amp commercial power service. You introduce a newer system, before you even install any part of a new active grade crossing warning system, the first questions you start to ask is what is available for commercial power? And in those communities, in a lot of cases, we had to run all new commercial power to all these sites so that we could install and then test. But that coordination, imagine calling Eversource or National Grid and saying, "Hey, I need a 200 amp service dropped off next to the railroad tracks." It's often not as smooth as you would like it to be. Um, but once all that's running on commercial power, failing systems over so that they operate on the battery backups, those batteries, they have to be fully discharged and recharged on cycles to verify that during any prolonged power outage, things would still work. Install a lot of backup generators. Those provide power for the actual interlockings, switch heater functionality, um, all of the uninterruptible power supply systems, like your small battery you have under your desk, so your computer doesn't glitch out during a power surge or a commercial power failure, and then all of the circuit protection behind that, lightning arresters and everything to prevent a cascading failure which, if for those of you who have seen what happens when you start to experience a code line failure, it's amazing how it starts in one little spot on the system, and 10 minutes later, your stop signals for miles and miles and miles. So we focus heavily on the robustness of the communication systems between radio, wayside to dispatch office data links. The fiber optic system, particularly with a positive train control system, is huge. Um, the South Coast Rail territory, for the most part, all new fiber optic cables installed. There was some legacy equipment on the run from Boston down to Middleborough that was built out as part of the original Old Colony rebuild. But I know there's a lot of pictures on the internet, a lot of videos I've seen too. But when the plow trains were running, plowing that fiber optic cable in, for those of you who have never seen it, I know we have some videos on YouTube of when that fiber was being plowed in. And it's a pretty impressive thing if you've never seen it. Um, so all of those systems, again, I'll keep saying it, they have to work together and they have to work consistently. Because as you submit your test results to the FRA at the end of every day, they have a team of people who they will comb through the test results and look for the anomaly. And that's when it's more important that you have called out the failure. You've gone back as the carrier to retest. You've addressed the problem rather than have them tell you what you did wrong. And then getting into the actual, the concrete steel infrastructure, stations, layovers, and the actual equipment. Um, Stations, we had 6 brand new stations. Every station requires its own testing regime. Platform edge detection, the tactile strips along the platform edge, the in-station PA systems, making sure that communication is audible, it's clear. The visual displays are all part of accessibility. All of those have to be tested, and they have to be tested reliably. Some stations introduced elevators into their locations. East Taunton, for example, those systems have to be tested and validated just like they were part of the railroad infrastructure. FRA checks all of those inspection records, how we tested that out, and then you have to coordinate with the local building inspectors as well. So there's a lot of layers there. Stations, of course, security cameras, call boxes, HVAC systems, fare validators, ticket vending machines, everything that a passenger has to interact with has to function flawlessly. The layover facilities in New Bedford and Fall River, they have their own set of tests as well. We have to make sure that the ground power systems are all functioning as they're designed. Lots of safety interlocks with that as well. All that has to be tested out. Even something as invisible as the drainage system within a layover. You have to remember these are locomotives carrying several thousand gallons of diesel fuel. All of that spill collection for the what ifs, all of that has to be validated, confirmed that it's functioning as it's designed, because you don't want to find out when you have a locomotive with a leak in a fuel tank that all of a sudden your containment systems don't work. Not a good place to be. Every layover, multiple switches, they all have to be checked out. Security gates to keep motor vehicles out, to keep people who are unauthorized out. Uh, Again, the list of testing and validation, it just goes on and on and on, right down to the actual equipment that we operate. Now, this was an interesting discussion because we didn't introduce new equipment for South Coast Rail. The same coaches that run on the rest of the system, they ran on South Coast Rail when it opened. Same locomotives, but because we built out all this new infrastructure, new stations, layovers, all the clearances, all those have to be validated, verified, locomotive compatibility. Between curvatures, the new Middleborough station is on a nice gentle curve, but you have to make sure the train can get through that curve without bumping against the platform. Uh, right down to doors opening, level boarding for accessibility. All of that has to be measured out, door by door, train by train, consist by consist, and adjustments get made almost in real time. We come back and we do it again. We do it again and again to make sure that once those stations are all approved, Passengers show up and we know that we can put them on the train and get them where they have to go. Crew qualifications and route familiarization, obviously physical characteristic testing, so that our train crews know where they are, know where they're operating is a big part of this. The commuter rail network has a very long roster with a lot of folks who we have to qualify. Um, every crew member who qualifies on the territory, it's broken out into anywhere from 10 to 20 separate testing events, um, from riding the line, getting familiar with it, drawing your maps, and then actually getting signed off as being certified and qualified on that piece of territory. Um, you talk a lot about the responsibilities involved. Anytime you have a new territory, um, it's something that you cannot cut corners on. Unfortunately, there's been some incidents in the industry where new starts, new services have resulted in some really tragic outcomes because this portion of the testing was rushed, and we made it very clear to every stakeholder that there is no schedule that we are going to compromise the quality of this testing on. I've been a locomotive engineer for my entire functioning life. And, I know what it's like to have to learn a new piece of territory, and there's nothing worse than having to rush it. And then the first time you have people behind you at 79 miles an hour, that's when it hits you if you're ready or not. We need to make sure that folks were ready. Between the familiarization testing, the actual written examinations, the map drawing, um, it takes a lot of time. So as we figured out what the schedule would look like for the opening of the service, obviously we target those crew members first. You start with a bare minimum and you work up so that eventually everyone who is going to operate on that territory is qualified. We'll talk more about that. And then, of course, transitioning into an actual approval from the FRA. We talked about all the subsystems, everything that goes into it. But then we have to prove to the FRA that everything that was validated actually met all of the standards. Now, the Code of Federal Regulations, a lot of you are familiar. It's a book that thick. You can't really see it, right? It's a big, heavy book. It's written.
3 inches at
It's
least.
written like you would expect federal regulations to be written. It tells you just enough, but often not enough. But we treat the Code of Federal Regulation as the bare minimum. And every system that I've talked about has its own program to go with it. It's part of the documentation we have to submit to the FRA as the carrier. So we often make things more restrictive than is required by the CFR. But then the FRA actually has to come in and make sure that we're doing what we said we would do. So once the FRA comes in during their observation period, once they're satisfied that everything was functioning as it should, we go into pre-revenue uh, demonstration. Um, and again, they're just sitting there watching that full-scale simulated operation. And once they are satisfied that everything is working, meeting the requirements, meeting our standards, they grant an approval. And on to the next slide. At 4:27 in the morning on Monday, March 24th, we were on our way. Um, the slide speaks for itself. I'm sure a lot of you were probably on those first trains, whether it was out of Boston, New Bedford, or Fall River. But after so much time, after so many years of talking about it and planning it, 67 years later, everything came together, and the South Coast communities were again connected to Boston, which was a really big deal. I know a lot of folks on my team. I mean, they were straight out for days leading up to this, making sure that everything was where it had to be. And not just the MBTA team, but Keolis Commuter Services played a huge role in getting us to where we need to be, because at various points, certain parts of the project go from construction to operations, and those assets get handed over, not in just one big lump sum, but bits and pieces. So the first trains leave. We did a lot to try to get people on board. We offered free rides on weekdays through the end of March and free weekend service through the end of April. Um, with a lot of community support, we provided free parking at those 6 new stations during that promotional period, and it was really a tremendous start. There was so much public support and a lot of people. And here, one story I'll share. Back when we first broke ground on this project, an elected official, and his name escapes me, um, was there, and he had a shovel in his hand. And of course, like any groundbreaking, there's lots of shovels. Everyone takes a ceremonial scoop. And I remember seeing him and saying, "Oh, well, you didn't have to bring your own shovel." And he said, "Well, I brought this one, but I have another one in the car. I brought every shovel from every groundbreaking that we've done for South Coast Rail." But we were finally here. And, the support of the communities, all of our stakeholders, those first trains were very popular. But when you start something new, particularly in an environment like this, that once you make things real, adjustments are necessary. And we were challenged, and those challenges really emerged in the early weeks of the service, and not necessarily related to the track and signals and all of that. Where we really struggled was the amount of crews that were qualified on the territories. I described earlier, it's a very complex process, and it's not something that just happens overnight. And I also mentioned that we weren't going to compromise on this particular component. So you'll see that right around week 4, if you see on the chart here, that's when we really started to feel the pressures of um, really normal disruption. People call in sick, people retire, unexpected absences, all those pressures started to mount. And right about the 4th week of the service, we really started to feel that. Now, leading up to and all the way through, for the following year to come, we continue to qualify folks, but it's not an instant process. It does take time. And, we for several weekends, we had buses available just to protect service, to make sure that, people still could get to where they had to go. But as you can see, from week 4 into week 5, 6, 7, 8, things started to stabilize. And we quickly, by week 6, we're back up to, I'm going to call it a respectable level of service operated. Then week 4 dropped down to about 94% of trains operated. But as you can see, right back to 100%, 99%, and 100% for week 6, 7, and 8. And we just continue to focus on getting people qualified. There's a lot of work rules that cover labor agreements and union agreements, so people are allowed to bid work based on seniority. And as the commuter rail system gets bigger, we've always had a north side and a south side. When you look at the size of the south side, this really kicked off what is essentially a third division. Northern Division, the Southern Division, and the Old Colony Division. So it's tough to expect any one person to qualify on all of that. So we were able to focus qualification efforts on the South Coast territory, on the Old Colony service. And like I said, within weeks of opening, we're able to get this controlled and get it back to where we needed to be. But the experience, really shaped how we think about workforce planning for any new service. There's a lot of lessons learned there, and I think that a lot of other agencies, as they go down the road of starting any new service, unfortunately at our expense, but I think that a lot of folks understood quickly how important it is to peel a few layers back. And just because on paper it looks like everything's going to be fine, every line opening is going to be different. If I could go back in time, we would have started to qualify folks much earlier to prevent that sort of week 4 slip. But lessons have to be learned. And again, there was no room to compromise on rushing people through. It had to be done right. Once we were able to stabilize, the ridership story, it became really compelling. April through December of 2025, the Fall River New Bedford Line delivered over 2.1 million rides. compared to the 1.6 on the pre-existing service to the former Middleborough Lakeville station during the same months the year earlier. It's roughly a 37% increase. Pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. And it wasn't just about absorbing riders who traditionally went to Middleborough Lakeville. These are people who for 67 years didn't have access, didn't have rail access to Boston. Hospitals, schools, and beyond Boston. I talk a lot about publicly the connection between the South Coast community and Bridgewater State University, where we're seeing a lot of ridership who use the service. They never go to Boston, but they use the service to get to and from Bridgewater State. And people are just finding a better way to get to Boston. Weekend ridership, just like all the commuter rail lines, dramatic gains in weekend ridership. Lots of coverage. The Whaling Museum in New Bedford actually attributed a weekend spike in attendance solely to the South Coast Rail service. So once you get past the operational challenges and you prove that you are able to contain it, you get your arms wrapped around it. And I think what we saw was the ridership spike that we saw early on. We got through the slump of getting crews qualified. Then you start to see the broader impacts to having service like that. Our door is constantly being knocked on by development, transit-oriented projects near every station. In New Bedford, there's new restaurants opening, which prior to the arrival of South Coast Rail, it was a parking lot for the ferry service and not necessarily an area that I don't think many people would be going out to dinner, but we're able to revitalize a lot of those areas, and it's still really early to understand what the true economic benefits are. But I think in a very small amount of time, less than a year, we're already seeing a dramatic change. And, I think that shows just how important South Coast Rail is, despite the delays and the setbacks and the struggles, just how impactful a service like this can be to any area. And that sort of brings me to my closing thoughts. Building a safe railroad, it takes time, it takes repetition, it takes perseverance. You run thousands of tests before any single passenger ever sets foot on board. And it's a lot. And I got into a lot of detail about just what's involved, but that's what it takes to do it right. Second, we launched a new railroad, which is different than upgrading or improving an existing one. You need crews and not just enough to cover what the schedule says, but you also need to go a little bit deeper. Week 4 made that really clear in our operation, but we adjusted, we adapted, we overcame, and I think that the system is stronger for that. Third, when you build any good infrastructure and you operate it well, people will ride it. It's about providing transportation options. There's a lot of media buzz about ridership and questions about trains that are outside the peak period. I always try to explain to people that these trains originate and terminate in New Bedford and Fall River. So you may not see a full train between East Taunton and Fall River. But when that train leaves Boston, you have to remember it has to hit eight other stops before it gets there. And we see that certainly in the ridership, particularly coming in the morning. So we run a good service and we do it on good infrastructure, on new infrastructure, and people show up. And every month we see the results. And I'll leave you with this. All the years of planning, building, thinking about, conceptualizing, and then actually constructing it and testing it. March 24th, that morning at 4:27, a train full of people left New Bedford headed to Boston. And that train has been running every day since. I'm a railroad enthusiast, obviously. It's a passion that has fed into a career. But for me, there's nothing better than seeing something like this actually come to fruition. Could it have been done differently? Absolutely. Could it have been done better in some cases? But we learn. We we don't throw the plans away. We use it as a starting point for the next chapter. Um, and for those of you who have not had a chance to ride the service, I welcome you. I welcome you to come for a ride. I can't wait to see where it goes over the coming months, over the coming years, as we start to see more and more ridership take advantage of this connection between Boston and the South Coast region. I've talked an awful lot, but with that, David, I'm going to turn it back to you. Um, and if I see there's some questions in the chat, so we can go through that or whatever you like. I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's see. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'll just remind folks that getting those questions in the Q&A will get them answered a lot quicker. So early on, question, could you describe how much of this work was done by Keolis versus done by MBTA employees? And I would add to that by outside contractors.
Sure. So the construction was managed purely as an MBTA project. We stood up a dedicated project office for South Coast Rail, um, and the operation side of the house, MBTA railroad operations, and we rely heavily on Keolis to perform a lot of those duties out in the field. We didn't start to really take any assets over until just about that last year of construction. Contracted forces working with the railroad of record at the time, which was Mass Coastal Railroad, when you talk about inspecting track, testing signal systems, testing crossings, um, so there's a lot of partnerships that form over something like this. And I mentioned earlier, this was still an active railroad as we were rebuilding it. Um, so, those railroad employees actually sign off on the actual testing based on our standards to accept those assets. And then the first thing that Keolis really did as part of this was Keolis started to dispatch these lines very early on because as the train control systems came online, the ATC system and the PTC system, you get a short line like Mass Coastal, who is very resilient and flexible. Um, but those systems and operating those systems, it's just not something that they do on a regular basis. So it made sense to bring that operation directly into the CTEC office in Boston when it was ready. And then it becomes incremental from there. Keolis takes over more and more responsibility as the assets get handed over, whether it's stations, parking lots, tracks, whatever the case may be.
Okay, I'm going to take these questions a little bit out of order. Has the South Coast passenger service caused the freight railroad to adopt a nights and weekends only schedule, or is there some freight service intermingled with the passenger service?
Yeah, so Mass Coastal operates across the board. They still run a lot of daytime service. During the construction, Mass Coastal had to shift a lot of their operations to overnights, weekends, because of outages, cutovers, other diversions as part of the construction. But um, any given day, just like on other parts of the MBTA territory, you can find freight operations going on intermingled with the passenger operations.
Okay. Next, this should be a simple one. How far is the New Bedford station from the Whaling Museum?
It's about I'm gonna call it maybe a 10-minute walk, which, for those who are familiar with New Bedford, maybe haven't been there in the last 10 years or so, that entire waterfront area where all the cobblestone streets are, New Bedford's done a great job of revitalizing that area. There's a lot of life, a lot of activity. Yeah, the Whaling Museum is just about a 10-minute walk.
Are there any thoughts of actually going down a little further?
Shortly after we opened, there were some questions about running service directly into um, where the boats pick up. I wouldn't want to say it's off the table, but I think right now we're focused on the actual built out territory.
There was a question about extending service. If Rhode Island had approached you about extending service to Newport, but that may be a bridge too far, so to speak.
There's a bridge that's missing. um, but I think that with the introduction of the South Coast Rail territory, I think that it opens up a lot of opportunity. I'm not super confident that the structure of the old swing bridge was maintained. So we have one movable bridge at the end of the Newburyport branch where if you keep going, there's a swing bridge. And we have been strategic in maintaining that bridge because once you remove a movable bridge from a railroad out of a waterway, it is very difficult to put it back. So that bridge at the far end of the Newburyport branch, we maintain it. We maintain the bumper system, the nav lights. The bridge is stuck open and it'll never close on its own. But we maintain that infrastructure because it's a footprint and it's there. I don't know if Rhode Island has something similar with that, but we have a great partnership with the state of Rhode Island with our service between Providence and Wickford Junction, Rhode Island, and we would always entertain a discussion.
Okay, next question. Uh, Person rode one of the early trains to New Bedford and noticed a lot of empty or undeveloped space along the way with the advent of the new service. Has there been a lot of new housing and apartment development starts, which will help alleviate the Massachusetts housing shortage?
Yeah, we have a dedicated transit-oriented development group within the MBTA, and they are literally nonstop fielding requests to meet and discuss, train service, real estate opportunities on MBTA property, and then through every community, there's always a mechanism for folks to get into the MBTA to discuss opportunities. But I think that we've seen along other corridors, and I'll single out Mansfield. Mansfield Station a decade ago, around the station proper, a lot of parking. All of a sudden, I want to say it's probably 18 stories, residential development, some commercial space on the first floor. Overnight that popped up, and all of those folks used the train. So I think that over the next 2, 3, 5 years, the development that is going to go on along this territory is going to follow suit with everything we've seen across the commuter rail. It's all about opportunity. The train provides that opportunity. So I think a lot of parcels of land that have sat vacant or undeveloped, I think this is the chance to breathe some life into it.
Okay, so we've had a number of questions about phase two or the full build option as to what the status of that is. Um,
So phase two, it's I wouldn't rule it out, but I will tell you the MBTA as a whole, we have a lot of competing internal interests, and what we were able to focus over the last 2 years on uh, really getting that foundation reestablished, whether it's light rail, heavy rail, the MBTA's transit system, or commuter rail with the opening of South Coast Rail. Phase two is not without its challenges. They've been well documented throughout the entire uh, 20-year planning process. It's not off the table. It's not necessarily, I think in the chat I saw someone use the term on the front burner, because we have a limited amount of financial resources to make sure that we don't fall backwards over the progress that we've made over the last 2 years. So it's a discussion. It's still on the table, but right now I think we're focused on investing in what we have versus any additional expansion at this time.
okay, another questioner comments that he check on Google satellite view, and the Route 24 bridge over the track south of East Taunton Station still appears to be unfinished. Is there any word on when that bridge work will be done and will and allow the second track to be connected?
So it's a MassDOT project that's still probably a year out. Believe me, I would like to be sooner because I get a lot of complaints about train horns in that area with the roadway workers being so close. So
Ah,
sooner the better for sure.
yeah. Um, let's see. Has technology on the South Coast Rail reduced the staff or crew size for daily operations?
No, not necessarily. No, I mean technology is probably most visible with how passengers can buy a ticket. Um, now you can buy a ticket on board using a debit card, credit card. It's well beyond cash. And to that point, there's a lot of improvement with technology. But as I talked about, that train may leave New Bedford. Um, by the time it goes to Middleborough, it's a third full. By the time it gets to Boston, it's still packed. So we still need to staff for that sort of key load, that key loading number. So technology doesn't necessarily reduce the amount of train crew needed, but it makes for a better experience for the passengers. And it might make some of the train crew's duties a little easier. Like I talked about, we don't have to make a lot of change and carry as much cash now. So it helps it, but it doesn't reduce the number of people needed.
Mhm. Okay, a few more questions. Early on, you mentioned train washing protocols as one of the things you had to work out. Um, what are the train washing protocols? And part of my question comes from my observations up here on the north side. I live in Andover. That a lot of the cars, particularly the Pullmans and the Bombardier cars, look like they haven't seen a car washing facility in years. Uh,
So the single level coaches are tough, and they're certainly showing their age. It's not necessarily a matter of rinsing off whatever residue is there. It's not stainless steel. Most of the car bodies are aluminum, and it's sort of ingrained now in the actual car body. If you go up and touch the exterior, you can actually kind of feel the grit into it. Could it be polished out? Probably. Um, do we necessarily want to prioritize that? I don't think so. We have had some good luck with wrapping some of those single level coaches, which for the cost involved, it's remarkable the results. It looks like a brand new car on the outside, versus the stainless steel, the stainless steel of the bi-levels. They clean up much easier. But basically, on the north side, when that train comes into BET, it goes through the S&I facility, gets fueled, serviced, inspected. As it's leaving the building to go into the layover yard, it goes right through a wash rack.
it does. Okay.
Southampton Street on the south side, it's the exact opposite. The train goes through the wash rack to come into the building, get service inspected, and then back out.
Okay. So, corollary question. I've noticed a lot of the windows are becoming more opaque, cloudy, heading toward bud car status, I guess. Even on the some of the bi-level cars. Granted, some of the bi-levels are 20 some years old, but
So it's funny that we talk about that as we talk about how the wash systems work. So to clean the stainless steel, it's a pretty aggressive uh, detergent. Makes the stainless steel look really nice. It wreaks havoc on the actual Lexan the of the windows. We do have a window project kicking off right now for the 900 series bi-levels. The 700, 1700 series, they get new windows when they were overhauled. And we expect that we'll just continue that with the first batch of 800 Hyundai Rotem coaches, until we get the fleet back to where it needs to be.
Okay. So one of the distinguishing characteristics of the South Coast Rail operation is the shuttle service with a cross-platform transfer at East Taunton. How'd you come up with that idea?
Well, so there was an original service schedule that was envisioned for South Coast Rail, and that really, that was designed. I think the first iteration was mid 2000s. It was further refined in the 2010s. Around 2017, I think, was the first real, like, this is going to be the operating plan. But then when COVID happened, as we revitalized the existing commuter rail system, we drastically changed our operation across all the other lines, and train frequencies went up so that there was a train basically every hour in every direction. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't degrade the services that we had seen so much success with coming out of a world of COVID-19. So service between Middleborough and Boston had achieved such a high level with a train every hour. We couldn't take away from that and open up New Bedford Fall River based on a six round trip a day schedule. So the shuttle at East Taunton was a great stopgap so that we could deliver a level of service that was in line with the rest of the system, provide some additional trips, some additional options. And I think that it's an interesting thing because as you get so far away from Boston, the ridership demands and the ridership needs change. So I mentioned a lot of those connections to and from Bridgewater State University. That shuttle train provides a lot of options for people trying to get there, and sort of acts as a captive service between New Bedford and Fall River. So it wasn't part of the original design, but in a world post-COVID, it fell into the levels of service that we have across the system.
Okay, I had one more question. We'll get back to the Q&A. How long does it take to qualify a crew member on the South Coast Rail route?
We typically try to allot 15 days or so. It depends. If you get folks who Um, maybe they have some experience on that line before, if they previously worked, for the operator out there. Um, I think already having a level of familiarity helps a lot. The first 2 or 3 days are literally just riding in the head end, taking mental notes, making observations, and then we try to qualify in 5 mile segments, 5 mile increments. Um, and it's exactly what it sounds. You draw a map based on your memory. There is a written component of that as well. It might be something like, what is the name of the interlocking between uh Cotley and Myrick's, so there's a written component as well. But typically 15 days is quick, and you know, in some cases it takes longer, but again, that's not something that you can really rush.
Okay, back to a few remaining questions here in the Q&A. Uh, First of all, uh, Bill Sample says another excellent program. Thanks to all who made this possible. Many good people leading the T these days, and I would concur with that.
Appreciate
Um,
that.
and Another question, what are your thoughts on restoring passenger service to Woods Hole? I know there's some agitation out there to replace the Falmouth part of the line with a trail.
Um, I mean, as someone who cut their teeth, on the Cape railroading down here, I every time I ride my bike on the fountain, well, on the bike path portion of the Falmouth line, I always say, "What if?" Um, it's something I'd love to see. I think the beauty of rail banking a lot of these rights of way is that it's always an option. Um, do I think that it would be beneficial? I mean, I imagine, the rail trail on the Cape all the way to Provincetown. Hindsight's always 2020, and I think that if that was still a railroad today, people would be grateful. I don't rule out the restoration of passenger service to Woods Hole. I don't.
Okay, but don't hold our breath.
Yeah, yeah. Depends on how long you can hold your breath for. The right of way's there.
Yep. Um, so another question, was there much cannibalization of Middleborough patronage by the opening of the new lines? Questioner says that happened with Greenbush.
No, I don't think so. I think that, there was a lot of concern early on about, you know, what about my train? What about my train? And, we saw a lot of residential growth around the Middleborough Lakeville station. I think a lot of folks self-diverted to the new Middleborough station. I think that the ridership demonstrates that we haven't lost any ridership. Um, I think that a lot of folks who previously boarded at the Middleborough Lakeville station under the old operating pattern. I think a lot of those folks get on their same train, but they get on at East Taunton, they get on at Church Street, they get on at New Bedford. So, um, yeah, I don't think it had any negative impact to the existing ridership.
Okay, and maybe this will be the last question. Um, Questioner writes, in the old days, the train would have split at East Taunton instead of needing a shuttle. This would be much more comfortable for passengers. Did the MBTA explore having trains split and join at East Taunton?
It's not as practical as it appears on paper. To make and break trains in the middle of their trip, you introduce a lot of risk. To make that connection, I have to shut down the head end power. I can't put people in between there with 480 volts. So, that whole process takes about a half hour. And that's a tough thing to tell people that they're going to wait at East Taunton while we break the train up before they can go to New Bedford or Fall River.
And as I recall, there's probably just about a 5 minute wait if you have to transfer to or from the shuttle,
Yep. Yeah.
or the
Yep.
train takes you
We
on your
try to
way.
schedule that in.
Okay, good. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the Q&A, and so at this point, I just want to thank everybody who attended tonight. We did get over 100 attendees, and so Ryan, thank you very much.